Just to protect my punctuality reputation, this clock is a bit fast. A little bit, 2 minutes fast. According to the phone, anyways. Okay. Welcome to week 5 of the series. Just before we begin, just a couple of announcements. First of all, today's shiur has been sponsored by two people. First of all, it's been sponsored by Sylvia Cohn, honor her husband's yahrzeit, Moshe Cohn. Also, it's also been sponsored in merit in the schus for a refuah shleima, a complete and speedy recovery for someone that's having surgery next week. For Yehuda Bas Miriam, it should be refuah shleima and only complete speed with lots of mazel and complete hatzlacha. Also, today is the last one of the series. I'm leaving on Wednesday, please God. I'll be back in 2 Wednesdays' time. Just want to mention, before the actual new term starts, which will be a new series, we're going to be having this 3 special Thursday mornings, which we're still going to be having. The one is the Thursday just before Rosh Hashanah. It's on these little flyers that you got. So I want to just do one special one before Rosh Hashanah comes. That'll be the day after I come back, which is fine. Called Happy New You and Well Over the Past. Then we have our traditional Sukkot morning tea in my sukkah at home, 52 Anglesey Street, which will be 17th of October at 9:20, same time, like we always do every single year. And then just a special thing, before we start the new series back here, I'm going to be doing a special session. I was approached by Shalom College, who's doing a very beautiful display this year. In conjunction with Sculpture at the Sea, they're doing Sukkot at the Sea at Marks Park. They have some very beautiful architecture. So I'm going to do a follow-up. It's going to be after Sukkot, but anyway, we'll do a follow-up session after Sukkot, a Kabbalah meditation session there. We'll have a bit of a tour, and then we'll do a session together. That's on Thursday, the 31st of October, same time, 9:20, at Marks Park. I'll send out more information when we get closer to where to park and how to go there and all that kind of stuff. And then after that, the actual new series will start on the 7th of November, but that's a while off. Okay. So bear in mind, diarize these 3 special Thursdays, which will have also, again, they'll all be, of course, personal growth focused, as they always are, in conjunction with all these different things. Okay. So we've been working through this book. These are the 3 ones. We've been talking about using language to stay above the horizon, using the above the horizon model, and how to deal with every day-to-day challenges, regular things, smaller things sometimes, and using the power of words, the power of language. As we talked about that, just like the heart follows the action, a lot of times it's our emotions which get us all worked up and give us the anxiety and the sadness or the resentment or the jealousy that we feel. And sometimes just by using words, we can, just like actions, words too have tremendous power. And we can also change the way we feel and the way we respond, either by doing something about it or just accepting it, acceptance versus action, as we talked about, by using just reinterpreting and re-scripting the narrative. 2 weeks ago, we talked about how that works when we work with ourselves, and how we define ourselves, the concept of our self-image, self-esteem, and so on. And last week we talked about judging, right? So we talked about how we judge others, especially in people we don't even know very well, or things that happen. And a lot of the judging has to do with our assumptions that we make. We interpret the experience. The experience is there, but we interpret it, and we come to conclusions. Our emotions start to rise, and we get into a bad mood. However, with simple change of language, we can actually reverse that. By the way, the apartment is working out very well. It's all organized. There's a backup plan in place. It's all good. Everyone's fine. So it's the words we use, is the story that we tell, and the story we create, and sometimes that has a profound effect. Just by simple re-scripting of the story, it has a tremendous effect on the way we feel, the way we respond, and our whole demeanor and our whole emotional response. Okay. We talked about how this is not to do with changing the story, it's just to do with changing the message. And we brought an example from Moses, who, when the Jews were going into Israel, said exactly the same thing that the spy said, which in the spy story was a terrible outcome, and in his case it was good. All that they were both saying is that Israel is a tough land to conquer. It's a place of fortified cities, a place of giants. They said it, he said it. They said it in the context of it's too hard, it's too overwhelming, it's never going to happen. Spun the whole nation into panic, into anxiety, into sadness. Whereas his message was, it's a tough land, that's a fact. Giants are there, it's a fact. Fortified cities is a fact, but you can do it because God's on your side. You're able to do it, you're able to conquer it, and it's going to happen. Very different message, same fact, same story, just different message. Okay. So today, just for the last time, I want to take a different chapter in the book, beautiful chapter, and talk about using the same model of interpreting what happens, but this time more about interpreting the past, the memories of the past. Okay, and that's quite a powerful topic. It's quite a powerful thing. Now, in order to do this, of how we relate to things that happened in the past, I want to just, as she does very briefly, just revisit a mindfulness idea that we talked about. Right? When we spoke about mindfulness, I mentioned this briefly last week as well. We talked about the concept of living in the now, right? And the way the modern mindfulness authors talk about it is living in the now, living in the moment, not judgmentally. In other words, completely disregarding the past and the future, understanding the freshness of the moment, the beginner's mind, as it's called, and fully realizing and fully maximizing the potential of the present moment, right? But as we talked about, particularly in a Jewish context, the past is important. And the past is not supposed to be, so is the future. And it's not supposed to be completely disregarded. And the reason for that is for two reasons. First of all, the past is an amazing teacher. And part of what we do is we learn from the past. We don't disregard the past, we learn from the past. Of course, this is very much in theme with the time of the year we are in the Jewish calendar, the time of Elul. As we've talked about in previous years, it's the season of change. It's known as the month of stock taking, the month of reflection, when we look back at the year. We don't obsess with this the whole time, but in Elul we do. We try, as we approach the new year, to actually have a look at the last year. Not just to forget about it, but to have a look at it. Reflect upon it. Understand what our strengths were, what our weaknesses are, and learn from it. There's a lot in the past that could teach us in terms of how we go forward, right? That's the idea of tshuva. The idea of tshuva is part of the components of tshuva, as we've talked about in previous years, is to learn from the past, to understand things that we could have done better, things that we've done well, but things we could have done better, and to learn from them and to repair them, right? So that's number one. That's why the past is important. The second reason the past is important is because our life story is not just a series of different moments. It is. Each moment is unique, and each moment has its own potential, and each moment has potential that is not dependent on what happened yesterday. However, having said that, it is also true that life is a story. Life is a continuum. Life is there to create an overall mission as well. In the past, we've connected this with an interesting halachic discussion, if you remember. There's a famous mitzvah between Pesach and Shavuot to count the Omer, right? We count 49 days of the Omer, and there's two opinions. Whether counting the 49 days of the Omer is each day considered a separate mitzvah, or is it one long mitzvah, right? And I'm not going to go through the halachic ramifications of it, but we've mentioned these two opinions in the context that actually there's a whole philosophical lesson from this. The two opinions are both correct on a philosophical level. On the one hand, every day is a separate mitzvah, meaning every day is separate. Every day is not dependent on yesterday. I can wake up in the morning, I've got a fresh soul, a fresh opportunity, a fresh day. The sun has risen, it's a new day. No matter what happened yesterday, no matter what I messed up on yesterday, no matter what relationship issues I had yesterday, today's a new day. Today I can make work because it's a fresh world, it's a fresh me, it's a fresh soul. So that's like every day being a separate concept. But on the other hand, we also have that opinion that the whole Omer is one mitzvah because life is one story. We build. Every year we build on the year before. Every month we build on the month before because we're here for an overall mission. We have an overall goal to live a value-based living, to live a life of meaning and purpose, which doesn't happen every moment. It happens in a combination of moments, a combination of years, a combination of weeks. So therefore the past is important, but the problem is just to find that balance. So mindfulness teaches us to live in the moment, which means not to let the past define us and interfere with the moment, but not to be disregarded or either, right? Just to use a paragraph which she puts in the book, she says, you know how people often say, live in the moment, there's no time like the present. She says, I definitely hear their point, but at the same time, today's moment was a result of lots of previous moments and will determine the outcome of lots of future moments. I've considered ordering a bumper sticker for my car saying, I strive to live each day as if it's my last, that's why I never fold the laundry. She's got a cute sense of humor throughout the book. For years I've been thinking that there's got to be a balance between being all fragmented about the past and the future, but also living for today. Right? So that's something we need to understand, how that works, that balance. So, as I said, we spoke about it when we talked about mindfulness, that what it means really is, the past is very important, but it means that not to let the past define the moment. Right? In other words, the past can be a teaching and a lesson, a teaching tool and a lesson for what happens in the moment, but it cannot define the moment. In other words, when we bring the past into the moment, or better said, we drag the moment into the past and we get stuck there, that's when it becomes impossible to live in the moment. Right? You'll see where this is going in a minute in terms of the model we're using here. Right? But we use the past, but we don't let it define the moment. We take from the past as much as we can just to learn about what to do in the moment to maximize the moment, to maximize the now to its absolute fullest potential. Right? But we don't let it stand in our way, and we don't let it define who we are. That's the greatest mistake people make, when they let the past define who they are now, and therefore behave in the now, in the context of the definition of the past, and therefore never progress. Because we're always stuck. We're stuck in some future, right? And she says, the events that happen outside our bodies are processed and stored in our memories and inform the way we relate to our past. In other words, so what she's really getting to is like this. That we have memories and we do remember what happens in the past. And the past is the past. And it needs to be used. But it needs to be used productively and constructively. And that's going to depend on the narrative, on the story of how we use language to interpret what happened. In other words, we're not going to change the past. The past is the past. And it happened. The things that happen are that happen. So this is the theme we've been talking about the whole time. The facts are the facts. However, the way we let it come into the future, and the way we interpret the past, and the way we let it teach the moment of the now, will determine how productive the now could be. Right? I want to show you something which I'm going to show you again. It's an amazing, fascinating thing, but it's beautiful, so I'm going to show it to you again because it's so relevant to this topic. It's got to do with two Hebrew words, Vayehi and Vehaya. Now this is in classical Hebrew I'm talking about. So let me just share with you two things, first of all, and then show you an amazing thing of how it works. In classical Hebrew, if you look at the Chumash just as a language thing, you need to know the following, right? There's a grammatical thing called Vav HaHipuch, which means, you see that letter in red, the Vav at the beginning of those words? What the Vav does in the Chumash is it changes the tense. So, for example, Vayedaber means, and he spoke, which you don't do that in modern Hebrew, because the word Yedaber means he will speak. But in Chumash, in classical Hebrew, when you put a Vav at the beginning of the word, you say Vayedaber, it means not and he will speak, it means and he spoke. Right? Is that clear? Yeah. Therefore, when we have the word Vayehi, the word Yehi means it will be. Vayehi means and it was. Right? Conversely, the word Vehaya, Haya means it was. Vehaya means in the Chumash, and it will come to be in the future. Okay? Now, the Talmud says a fascinating thing. The Talmud says that any time in the Tanakh, or most times, there are a couple of exceptions, but most times when you see the word Vayehi, it spells trouble, pain. Example, very beginning of the Purim story. Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh. It was in the days of Achashverosh. And then right after that, Haman comes along and causes trouble. The book of Ruth starts with the word Vayehi. Vayehi b'mei Shvat HaShoftim. It was in the time of the judges. What happens afterwards? Disaster. Elimelech, the judge, leaves Israel, the laws of the family, abandons his brethren. his daughters marry, they die, their sons-in-law die. It's a whole, it turns out okay at the end, but it was a bad story, right? However, whenever you see the word v'haya, right? V'haya, which means it will be, that spells joy. There are a number of examples of that. V'haya means, the Talmud says, it's a lashon shel simcha, it's a language of joy, right? That's what it says. So putting this all together, I once saw a very, very beautiful idea, a very beautiful thought. Why is this over here? Why is one pain and one simcha? So the way it works like this, taking what I told you before about changing the tenses. So, yehi means it will be, right? Moving forward. Vayehi changes the tense to future to past. When you take the future, when you take the now moving forward, and you make it get stuck in the past, that's pain. That's painful. That's not constructive. That doesn't help. That just paralyzes and prevents the person from growing, because you always remain stuck in the past. You've taken something that could be future, that could be looking ahead, that could be moving forward. You put a vav in the beginning, which means vayehi. You've changed it now into the past. You make it stuck in the past. It's an expression of pain. Conversely, however, when you have a word like haya, it was past, but you put a vav in between and say, yes, the past was, but we're gonna just take the past enough to support the future, v'haya, and it will come to be. You're taking the vav and you're making the past. It's still there, but it's there only as a teaching tool, as something to learn from, so that you cannot get stuck in the past, but you can go v'haya, and it will be. You can move forward and you can continue to build and progress. That's a lashon of simcha. That's an expression of joy. So I thought I'd just share with you again, because exactly what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is how to interpret the past. In other words, that the past happened is a fact. That the past is going to affect the now is also a fact. Because we can't divorce ourselves from the past. With all the mindfulness training, with all the looking at the moment and looking in the now, we can't just disregard our past history. In fact, it's not even helpful to do that. It's dangerous sometimes. But what we can do is we can be careful of how we interpret the past to determine how the now and the moments following the now is going to be. Okay? So of course, one of the things we do, again going back to the mindfulness idea, is we learn how to focus on the now, and that through meditation, through mindfulness exercises and so on. But it's not enough, because you don't do that all day. That's just like going, doing some exercise and you strengthen the muscles. But it's about how we live the entire day, and therefore it's about the language we use and how we interpret the past. So what she says in the book is the following. She says, our pasts are incredibly important. Our pasts are incredibly important parts of our narratives, not only because they are formative in how we develop, but because we tend to use them to view and shape the future. While we can't change what happened to us or what we've already done, we can decide to revisit how we want to relate to it all, and how we want to do, and what we want to do presently and going forward. Right? So this is the core of what we're talking about today. So the first thing she does, and I'm just going to share with you briefly how this happens. She says we all have stuff in the past that we think about, stuff in the past that went wrong, stuff in the past that was painful, perhaps traumatic, in all different layers and all different levels, right? But there's a number of, she runs through a number of different ways that people approach the past. So for example, first one is what we call victimhood, right? That's a common one. What do people do? They take something that's happened in the past and blame everyone else for it, making themselves into a victim. So in other words, again, the story never changes. It's about how we talk about the story. So people talk about the story, it was this one's fault, it was that one's fault, how could they do this to me, and so on. Now, what happens with victimhood, why do people do this? Because it works, short term, right? It feels good, short term. We hold, by becoming a victim, we hold other people responsible for our pain. We're able to make excuses for things that we will do in the future, things that we continue to do. It's not my fault, this is the way I was educated, this is the way I was affected, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this painful or troubling stuff coming forward, we just blame other people. We blame other things, we blame other experiences, which are all true, by the way. But we shift the responsibility from ourselves onto other people, right? Or other things. Now, what happens with that is, obviously, it's not productive, because what happens with that is it just gets us stuck in the past, and it doesn't allow us to move forward. It feels good short term because it takes away responsibility, and by default, most human beings don't like to take responsibility. Right? Why? Because taking responsibility is hard work. It's very simple. And our ego, our self-centered sort of short-term taking care of ourselves, for most of us, we like to take the easy way out. Therefore, taking responsibility is hard. Taking responsibility normally means not blaming ourselves, but it normally means that we have to work hard to be who we want to become, or to live how we want to live, and to make the moment most valuable and purposeful the way we want to do it. And if we don't do that, it's short-term, it feels easy, but long-term, it feels like a jail. Because we end up not being productive, it breeds resentment, it breeds anger, it breeds, ultimately, tremendous unhappiness. People that always look in the past in a victimhood context are very unhappy people, generally speaking. Normally, that unhappiness comes with other things like resentment, anger, all kinds of things. But it's a very, very unhealthy way of looking at the past. The second way she talks about is denial. Right? What she calls denial or forgetting or repression. Sometimes in the pursuit, this is an important one, because sometimes in the pursuit of moving forward, what some people do is they just try to pretend it didn't happen. I'm okay, I'm fine, nothing happened. Also not healthy. Why? Because things that happened did happen. And we know this from modern day research that you can't just forget about something. Meaning sometimes memories are repressed, but they come back to bite you. They re-explode. Right? Because the power of the subconscious is very powerful. In fact, the power of the subconscious is stronger than the power of the conscious. Right? So when we intentionally, and people do this, when we intentionally suppress a memory, or we intentionally pretend something didn't happen or something wasn't painful, I'm fine. People say, I'm fine, it's good, okay. Right? They're not fine. So sometimes they talk themselves into that they're fine. What that does, it takes the memory, it takes the pain, it takes the trauma, it takes the things that happen, the negativity, and all it does is it pushes it down from the conscious to the subconscious. Right? And when something is pushed down from the conscious to the subconscious, it's very, very strongly there. In fact, it's more embedded in who you are than when it's in the conscious. Right? You know, we once talked about this idea of forgiveness before you go to sleep. Right? There's the famous prayer, the prayer of forgiveness before you go to sleep, to forgive people. What does that prayer actually mean? It's an amazing thing. First of all, why is it there, and what does it mean? The reason it's there, I mean, it's got to be said properly. I mean, if it just said like we rattle off some other prayers, then it's meaningless. But provided we say it properly, in other words, we actually remember what we, because I once said this to someone who I know said this prayer every single night, was going on and on and on about how they're so angry at someone else. So I just said to them once, I said, do you, just out of interest, do you say this prayer every night? She says, yeah, of course, it's in the Siddur. So I paused and smiled, and then the person got exactly where I was going, and it was too late. You know how sometimes you do that? You put someone into a trap. And she says, yes, I know it should mean that, yeah, but, right? So why is it so important to say that prayer, or to work on that prayer at least? I guess that's why we say it every night, because sometimes it takes a long time till we can get to the level of forgiveness. And forgiveness is a complicated subject. We've talked about it before. It doesn't mean agreeing, it doesn't mean forgetting, it just means letting go of hate and letting go of resentment. Why is that so important before we go to sleep at night? Why is it in the Siddur, in that place? Because it's no good for us to go to sleep and not forgive. Because when you sleep, things go from the conscious to the subconscious. And when things go from the conscious to the subconscious, they're harder to get rid of. They're embedded, they're part of who you really are. Your conscious is easy to shed, your subconscious is much more difficult, right? But also, when we talk about forgiveness before you go to sleep at night, don't forget, forgiveness means you're not in denial. In other words, forgiveness means that you have a need to forgive, which is fine, and that's good. If I have to say the prayer, and I have to say, Master, as the prayer reads, Master of the universe, I hereby forgive, etc., etc., all those that have angered me and hurt me and offended me and so on and so forth, that means you have a need to forgive, which is fine, because it was painful. And to go into denial and to pretend that there's no need means that you're doing the same thing. That's the same thing as not forgiving. Just like not forgiving before you go to sleep pushes it from the conscious to the subconscious, not having the need to forgive in the first place does the same thing. And that's not good. Understand? Therefore, the other response to our past memories is denial or forgetting or repression, unhealthy. Because what you're doing then is, you're trying not to breed negativity, but you're making as if the story didn't happen. And don't forget, the whole point of what we're talking about in this series is experiences happen. We don't change the facts. We don't change the facts about ourselves. We don't change the facts about what happened. What we do is we learn to just re-script the narrative, to use language that it comes much more into a positive context rather than change what happened. So denial is trying to change what happened, and that's not healthy. Similarly, the third sometimes we do is we don't deny, but we trivialize it. It was nothing. Yeah, it happened, it was nothing, that kind of thing, right? Similar. What we're doing is we're being internally dishonest, and often later we pay a price. So something happens, we either try to forget about it, we trivialize it. Trivialize also means I'm not going to deal with it, it's okay, it doesn't matter, don't worry, they'll get over it, I'll get over it, we don't need to deal with it, we don't have to have a conversation, we don't need to meet, all those kind of things that we say, also problematic, because what happens is, it happened, and it wasn't trivial. And if it wasn't trivial, it needs to be dealt with, and if it's not dealt with, it could be a problem. The fourth way people deal with the memory is exaggeration. This is, some people just are prone to exaggeration, and it's a very big problem. It's very entertaining when they tell a story. People tell a story and they embellish the facts. It makes a very good story, and then you challenge the facts. They say, don't let a good story get in the way of the facts. That's good when you're telling stories. I don't mind that. That's fine. When you're telling stories and entertaining people and keeping people's attention, that's great. The problem is that people who are prone to exaggeration also tend to compound past pain or past challenges. Like, could you imagine? This happened, and they embellish the facts. And when you start embellishing things, it's amazing what memories can do to people. People actually create, the way they interpret their memories creates the memory. It's unbelievable. On a conscious level, right? I don't want to sound old, but I'm getting older and older. I'm realizing this more and more. I'm realizing because I used to be naive. I used to imagine when people tell me a story of what happened. That's the facts. That's what happened. I don't know the person to be an intentional liar, so right? And I realized over the last number of years that this could be about anything, not even about pain or challenges, it's about stuff, right? People have a certain picture of what happens sometimes. They can just tell you an interesting story, and you find out later it's completely inconsistent with the facts. They weren't even trying to intentionally lie to get out of something. It was just the way they remember it. It's an amazing, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've started to realize this more and more in the last number of years. It's an amazing thing. And with some people what happens is it's got to do with exaggeration. Now, it normally is harmless. It's just stupid, but it's harmless, right? When you're just telling stories. Where it is harmful is you're telling a story of how something painful or challenging affected you. Then exaggeration becomes it's not harmless anymore. It becomes a real problem, right? So it is really important. Now we all do this to a point because none of us, unless we have unbelievable memories, remember everything that happened 100%, right? But we have to keep it sort of to a minimum, right? So we need to try and not do that, because before we can interpret what happened in a positive way, we should try at least be interpreting the right story. Right? It gives us a head start. So when we exaggerate something or make it huge, much bigger than it was, it becomes harder sometimes to interpret in a constructive and a helpful and positive way, right? So exaggeration doesn't serve us well. It actually damages us. Another very important one, we're going to come back to some of these soon, but I want to just go through the list. This one is very important. It's the opposite of victimhood. It's called self-blaming, right? And people do this. They carry guilt. They assume fault, guilt, wrongness, responsibility for things and stories and facts that were beyond their own control, right? That's very damaging. We'll come back to that. Last two she talks about is obsessing, right? So it's good to remember stuff that happened in the past. It's good to deal with things that happened in the past. What's not good is to obsess about something that happened in the past. So not to be able to let it go to some level. So there's a very fine balance between learning from it, dealing with it, and hanging on to it. hanging on to the past is not a good. Let's go back to that Vayihi concept. When we hang on to the past, at the end of the day, it's about today. At the end of the day, it's about the new day that God has given us to make this life experience meaningful and purposeful. Learning from the past is great, but hanging on to the past is a problem. Very damaging, and that's where it comes obsessing, and some people do that. They hang on to stories in the past and just don't let them go, and that's like a real prison, an incarceration almost, an emotional incarceration. And finally, she says, the last way we'll deal with the past is selective memory. I guess conscious or subconscious, right? But selective memory, by the way, is a real thing. You know, not everyone, this is part of what I was telling you before. Not everyone that lies is a liar. Because they really believe it. Right? Lying is when you lie, you intentionally lie. Like, I know the facts, I'm telling you something different because I don't want to get in trouble. Or I want to convince you of something, or I want to manipulate you or something like that. That's lying. That's dishonesty. Right? Exaggeration is often not dishonesty. It's just, that's where the person thinks. Embellishing a story. The same thing with selective memory. Just people, it's got to do with the subconscious a lot. People kind of conveniently forget certain things, and after a while they really forget certain things. And they remember other things, or they forget parts of the story, remember other parts of the story. And all that is not helpful. Because again, the past is not something that should define the present. But the past is important. It's important to interpret it and to deal with it constructively and helpfully, in a helpful way. Right? Therefore, selective memory is not good either, because then you don't deal with parts of the story. So trying to remember actually what happened, you can consciously decide. You see, it's very different. When something happens that was painful or challenging, for example, you can then consciously work it through if you know the story, and then decide that certain parts don't matter. It's a conscious decision. That's fine. You know, that wasn't that important. To think about it, that wasn't that important. That wasn't the issue. That wasn't the challenge. So you've dealt with it and it's processed. But when you only, to begin with, select your memory parts of what you remember, what you don't remember, that becomes a real problem. And that, again, doesn't let you actually deal with the past in a constructive way. So let's just have a look at a couple of examples. So she goes through a bunch of different case studies and examples, but I'm just going to pick three because they're good examples, and just sort of it's good to expand on this and talk about it to a certain part, right? So one case she talks about, she makes up the names, and in a very cute way she chooses names that are like alliteration. So she talks about Valerie the victim, right? These are real stories, but obviously she changed the names. So she talks about a person that was one of three sisters, close in age, parents very busy professionals, and the older and the younger very different to her, and they're the ones that got all the attention. Right? This happens in families sometimes, right? So she remembers her childhood in a very sad way. She says Sabrina was the smart one. Our big sister was the one getting, straight A's. It was hard to follow in her footsteps. Linda was little princess, the pretty, lovely one. And I was a B student and only average pretty. Right? So I was always lost in the shuffle, and so on and so forth. Then she says, I love my parents. I know my parents loved and cared about me, but they were probably even proud of me, but I'm really nothing special. Right? I get along okay with my sisters, I have plenty of friends, but I've always felt the pain and ordinary. I dropped out of college, never pursued a career, and she goes on to talk about how her life's messed up. What she's subtly saying is, it really wasn't my fault. It was my parents, my older sister, my younger sister, not kind of blaming them, but just blaming the circumstance. Blaming the fact that her older one was smarter than her, younger one was prettier than her. She was nothing, she got lost in the attention, she wasn't able to achieve, and she's still, when she comes for therapy, still in that journey, still in that context, still in that mindset, right? Now this is a very real thing. This happens in all different ways to different people, about how they sort of define themselves in a certain way when they're children. And what happens is, by the way, it's very easy and you can't, it's very understandable how when this happens to someone that's younger, right, they actually end up creating that reality based on that definition. Because it's very hard for young children to redefine and reinterpret things, and therefore often with children, that's why we have to be careful as adults, not to let that happen in the first place. But if it does happen, it's very easy for children to slip into that type of self-definition. And what happens is that self-definition is very, very painful, and because it's very painful, it defines the narrative of their life to a great way afterwards, and you land up with someone like this that just drops out of everything, can't follow through a job. Why? Because this is someone based on her past experiences and based on experiences outside of her, truthfully, that she's defined herself in such a way that she's really an average person, not able to accomplish much. How did that happen? Because of a comparison to other people. But that's her world. That's her reality. So, and it lives with her. So she has a memory. Memory is true. It's an accurate memory, but it's interpreting the memory in a context of victimhood, right? So she works with this Valerie, and she asks her to interpret her past in different ways, and then with the use of language, she comes up with the model that we've been using throughout this series, which is below the horizon, on the horizon, and above the horizon, right? And if you remember, one of the things she cautions us in the book is not to change the facts, and therefore not to be over positive. Part of being above the horizon is not changing the story and accepting the pain and accepting the facts for what they are, but just reinterpreting. So let me show you how that works, right? So obviously below the horizon is how she arrived, right? So my sisters are naturally gifted and celebrated. I'm dull and unimportant. I don't have the same advantages as they do. So I'll never amount to anything or feel good about myself, and there's no point in trying. Complete victim, based on true pain, true challenges, but built a reality which defines not only the moment, but defines the future as well. I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to amount to anything, right? You get kids like this a lot of times in school, which is, if you work with them when they're young, it's easier to change, but it's sad and it's very hard. On the horizon means not particularly negative, but pain. In other words, growing up, I didn't feel great, I didn't feel valuable, and I find that it affects my self-esteem. Not being hard on themselves, but just factual. So I find it affects my self-esteem, my sense of ambition is affected all the time. I'm going to try, but it keeps on affecting me. And then there's above the horizon approach. And again, it's using language. Again, using language, this is not affirmations. It's using language to re-script the interpretation of the story. So this is what she trains her to sort of think about and verbalize and come out, sort of let it affect the emotions. So above the horizon looks something like this. Over the years, I often felt inferior to my sisters. I see how I tend to get down on myself about not feeling special, even now as an adult, right? So stating the story, not changing the story. Sometimes I really let it get to me. Sometimes I really let it get me down. I guess my challenge is to figure out who I am or want to be. I may not be naturally brilliant or beautiful, but that doesn't make me useless. I like to see if I can find something I can be good at, enjoy and feel good about, and see how I can define myself without constantly grading or comparing myself to them, right? Very, very powerful this. In other words, not, like she says, it's not, because she gives another example later, she says it's not like the overreaching positive things, oh, I'm amazing, I'm extraordinary, right? That's the sort of the affirmation route, which actually doesn't work. It's actually not true. She actually wasn't as smart as her older sister, and she wasn't as beautiful as the younger sister. And that's okay. But that's not what defines her intrinsic value. What she was able then to re-script was, this happened, it was painful at the time, but my job is not to be a victim. My job, therefore, is to now discover myself, define myself, understand my intrinsic value. Intrinsic value means that everyone has intrinsic worth, that everyone has competencies, right? That's the very basic 101 rule of self-esteem and self-worth. We all have, we were put here on this planet because we have self-worth, and because we have competencies, and therefore I've got to find what defines me and not continue to define myself based on other people. So it was painful, but I'm learning from it. I'm learning from it that the reason that it was so painful is because the pain came from comparison to other people. The pain actually came from a mistake. The pain came from the erroneous mindset of defining oneself compared to other people, which is why it was so difficult. That's why I never got attention. That's why people didn't give me attention, because they did the same thing. We all do this. We sometimes define others, not only ourselves, but what they achieve, and therefore we regard others better than other people, which is a terrible thing to do. But that's what we need to understand what was happening, and therefore I need to learn what kind of mistake that is, and I need to learn how to define myself for what I am worth and what I can achieve, and I have to figure out what my intrinsic value is and what my competencies are and where I can make a difference to life experience and to the world at large, right? So that's the model. In other words, it's using words, using language, not changing the facts, not changing the pain, not disregarding the pain, but just re-scripting it so we learn a better story out of it, right? And get above and stay above the horizon. Then she gives an example. I'll just tell you two more of what she calls Debbie the Denier, right? It's an interesting story, actually, interesting case study. A person who grew up in a very toxic home environment where her mother was verbally and sometimes physically abused by her father, right? So this is someone who then started dating, didn't share this with her boyfriend, Dylan, because she didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary. And some people do this, it's a terrible thing. People grow up in a very, very negative thing. So instead of becoming a victim, what they talk themselves into is that they normalize it. So that's a denial, right? I mean, you can transfer this to anything. We sometimes just want to make something normal. So we do that, right? When it's not normal. In fact, even when her brother moved out of the house angrily at 16, yelling about how he wanted to get as far away from his father as possible, she just said, teenage hormonal rebellion. He'll get over it. So she loved her parents, which people do naturally, described them as traditional. And then she starts dating, and this is where it comes back to bite. You see, the denial helps for a certain amount of time. But it doesn't help long term because it comes back to affect you, right? So she starts dating this guy called Dylan, and he thinks that she's amazing. They're compatible, they think similarly. But after a few months, he starts to worry if it's too good to be true. He notices that she never disagrees with him. I mean, this could be some people's dream, but it's actually not healthy, right? If it is someone's dream, they're in a lot of trouble. Right? Because that's actually not anything beautiful about any relationship with someone. When people always agree, it's a bad thing. It's how you disagree. That's a separate discussion. We've talked about this many times, right? So when he expresses disagreement with her, she usually changes her mind to match his. Right? If he ever gets a little bit upset about something, she just gets busy and unavailable for a few days. Right? She starts ignoring his calls. But I mean, that kind of thing is going to catch up because she can't handle it. Kind of jogs something within her and she goes away, right? So then what happens is they're dating for a while. It's an interesting story. And he comes to her family for Thanksgiving dinner, which is a big thing in America. He witnessed clearly how unkindly her father treated her mother and how broken her mom seemed to be. After they left, he tried to mention it to her in the car, and her reply was, you just don't understand the old generation. They're really happy together, they just have their own way of showing their affection. Right? So she suggests that, no, that's not going to work. Right? And he starts to show her how it's affecting her. And how ultimately, and intelligently he does this, to show her how ultimately it's going to affect their relationship. If she doesn't deal with it, right? What happens? She disappears again with a stomach bug for a few days and kind of hopes all going to go away, right? That's what happens. In a denier, what happens is that when the thing surfaces, they distract themselves with something else, hoping it'll just go away and then get back to normal, right? Which catches up with you and doesn't work, right? So, when you start to deal with something like that in the past, either you deal with it below the horizon, as she explains, where she comes to the realization that it's not right. So how does she start to deal with it? Well, she can deal with it by saying, well, he was really a bully, come to that realization. But that can be very, very painful, right? And she says, therefore, the only way to be safe in the relationship is to make, this could be a conscious, subconscious decision, is to never challenge the other person, which is very bad, of course, right? Or maybe not go into a relationship altogether, which some people do because they're scared. That's risky, right? But if you go above the horizon, you learn from it. You make the past not define you, but you make the past and you work through. This is very, very difficult. I don't know if you know this, but the research is that people come from abused homes get into abusive relationships very, very often. It's a very, very sad reality because of this, because it's never dealt with properly. Either because they're in denial and therefore just it's their normal and they've kind of, well, that's the reality that they know and kind of slip into and kind of attract to the same reality. And therefore it's a very, very sad thing. So it's a kind of past where you actually really have to deal with, and you really have to not ignore, understand the pain, understand how it affected you, and understand, therefore, what to learn from it. So it would look something like this, right? Above the rise would mean that she starts to say, Dylan noticed that I don't seem to stand my ground very much. I never realized how much my mom's style of being in a relationship sort of rubbed off on me. I guess seeing my parents' slanted marriage got me in the mindset and habit of just trying to keep the peace. It's just second nature to me. But he might have a point. It might be helpful for me to challenge myself, to be honest about myself, to get to know myself. I love my parents and as much I can learn from them, but I have to revisit this as an adult and understand that that's not on. Because otherwise I won't be able to be in a relationship. Because being in a relationship means, and we've talked about this many times, being in a relationship means that there's two people who are individuals. If one dissolves, that's not a relationship, right? Cooperation, compromise, respect, love, getting on, growing from each other, all of that. But it's two individuals doing that. Dissolving and becoming a nothing can't be in a relationship. And in fact, the nothing damages the person in the relationship and damages the person you're in a relationship with. So therefore, she needs to know, now, that did happen to me, it did affect me, what can I learn from it, how I might have to go to therapy for this, but it means I need to now revisit myself and revisit what it means to have a relationship and turn it around, transform it, Not to change it because it happened, but to make it into a tremendous teaching opportunity for how to actually be in a proper relationship. Right? And the last one I want to just touch on because it's really important. Again, it comes back to what also the time of the year that we're in, and this is sort of more practical for all of us, is the self-blamer, right? So I'm not going to go through the whole story, but it's a story of a child that grew up. Parents argued a lot, and then she would hear them argue in the room, and sometimes she would hear her name be mentioned, and she felt terrible. She thought it was all her fault. Then she was diagnosed with a learning disability, had to pay a lot of money. Again, it was her fault. And then her mother left the marriage because she had an affair with someone that was on this kid's soccer team. So therefore she again blamed herself, right? So as a kid this was all normal, and therefore she ended up blaming herself for everything that went wrong, right? And carried a tremendous sense of guilt. So this is an amazing thing. Now obviously, so she became a typical self-blamer. Everything's her fault, everything, she always apologizing. You know those people that always apologize for everything. I'm so sorry, I apologize, right? Because there's always guilt and ridden with guilt, and therefore guilt is a very debilitating, a very paralyzing emotion, which obviously she can never move forward. However, it's again the same thing. What does self-blaming actually do? How do we deal with it, right? Guilt, as we've talked about many times, guilt is not a terrible thing. It just depends how you use it. Right? If guilt defines you, it's a terrible thing. If guilt is there in a small dose to make you take responsibility and feel uncomfortable with your past, that's a good thing. And I say this because we've talked about this many times around this time of the year. Taking stock of the year gone by and moving and improving for the year to come means that we do identify some of our weaknesses. We do identify things that went wrong. And we're uncomfortable with them. We have to go through a stage. It's a stage of progress. It's a journey of improvement. We have to go through, part of the stage has to be where we actually do feel a great sense of discomfort of where we're at. We might feel a great sense of discomfort of our relationships, our spiritual status, our emotional progress, whatever the case is. And that's okay. Because if you don't feel uncomfortable, if you don't feel a certain level of guilt, you'll never move forward. Because if everything is okay, complacency is very damaging. Discomfort, not being comfortable with yourself, is constructive, provided that it results in taking responsibility rather than not taking responsibility. What happened in this story was a self-blamer is guilty about everything, the things that are her fault, not her fault, and also a self-blamer, actually self-blaming is almost very similar to victimhood. Because self-blaming and victimhood both shift responsibility. People that walk around a whole day self-blaming, I'm just totally dysfunctional. It's all my fault. You can scream at me and call me names, it's all my fault, but I'm not changing. Because everything's my fault. Right? And I'm just a bad guy. And I just mess up all the time. So if I mess up all the time, why bother? Right? So things that happen to children that make them do that, it's very damaging. But that's the point. The point is we need to shift that. Not shift the facts. Facts is things did happen. But what it is, it's learning how to interpret the past. And if I bring that back to the time of the year that we're in, this is the time of change. This is the time we actually have to do this. We have to look at the year gone by, not change the facts, not change the failures, not change the strengths either, but not change the things that we can improve on. And we feel a bit bad about them and we need to actually move on and improve them. But then we have to take it and really learn how to interpret them. Number one, the things that really aren't our fault need to be dismissed. That happened, it was painful, but it was beyond my control. If it was beyond my control, there's nothing I can do with it and nothing I should feel bad about. Those things that are in my control, I need to fix and take responsibility, but I also cannot let them define me. Right? It's also part of not being a self-blamer. Even if I look back at a memory, if I look back at a story, and something that I really messed up on, I said the wrong thing to someone, I let someone down, I was supposed to be there for someone and I wasn't, that's fine. But it also doesn't define me, because we all have our weaknesses, we all have our temptations, we all have our tests, but we all have an intrinsic value that allows us to fix and repair and rebuild. So therefore it's learning how to manage guilt. It's not learning how to dismiss what happened, it's remembering what happened, because if you don't remember what happened, we can't move forward. We can't learn to live a better life. We can't learn to live a more effective life. It's learning to understand what happened, but then to get above the horizon by using the right language to not let it define the moment, and to interpret it in a more constructive way, to say, yes, it did happen, and this is what I can do about it in the future. It's not going to define me, partly because it wasn't my fault, even the part that was my fault. It's just a teaching moment. Failure is good for us. Failure is a good teaching tool, and I'm going to use it for the now in order to become a stronger and more productive and helpful and more positive person. So that's just some of the examples of how this works. So memory works exactly the same way as everything else we've been talking about. Things happen, it's an experience, just like an experience that happens now or in the supermarket. It's an experience, the facts don't change, but the language that we use to interpret it will determine if we're below the horizon or above the horizon. Now, that's a very, very powerful thing, and I hope that was helpful. Again, as I said at the beginning of the series, it's more about dealing with simple things than huge things. Huge things sometimes need much big intervention. But it's helpful for all things, but particularly the things that we experience every single day, or the past week, or the past month, and so on and so forth. Just before you go, I want to just remind you that we're going to have one more session in a few weeks before Rosh Hashanah, not related to this, but it will be also on personal growth, called Happy New Year and Well Over the Past. As I said before, Thursday 26th of September, the Sukkot morning tea, and then the session in Marks Park with a sukkah by the ocean. It's on your little flyers. I'll be away for next Wednesday for 2 weeks. Have a great week, stay above the horizon, and we'll see you hopefully in a few weeks' time.